Good afternoon or evening, everybody. Welcome to this Young Trustees webinar. It's one of several in the series that we've been running for a couple of months now, where we've been talking to all of you as aspiring and as actual young trustees too. Now, today's session is going to be a little different to others because we're talking to two people from the same charity. So we have Mick and Rachelle here, who are both trustees of CAYSH, but that's all I'm going to say before I get them to introduce themselves. As usual, should you have any questions that you want to ask, drop a note in the chat box to say you have a question to ask, and then I'll invite you to ask it when it's appropriate. If you would like to ask the question anonymously, then private message me by changing the blue button in the chat to Leon, and I will read out your question for you. So we will get started. So Rachelle and Mick, big welcome to you both. Can I ask you to just introduce yourselves, starting with you, Mick?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Leon. My name is Mick Williams. I'm Chair of CAYSH. And if you're wondering about the strange acronym, when the charity was formed nearly 40 years ago, the internet hadn't been invented. So somebody formed the Croydon Association for Young Single Homeless. And perhaps 10, 12 years ago, that didn't exactly trip off the tongue, so it's rebranded to CAYSH. It's a charity based in South London. We're in 5 boroughs, and we offer accommodation and support to homeless people, young homeless people between the ages of 16 and 25. I joined the board about 8 odd years ago and have been chair since April last year. Rachelle.
Thanks, Mick. Rachelle?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Rachelle, and I am a trustee and also chair of the Finance and Development Subcommittee. I've been a trustee for just over 3 years now and chairing the subcommittee for just over a year.
Great, thank you. And today's theme is, as you will have seen in the advertising, because you're all here, is around induction and training processes. And when we did our briefing call for this, we spoke about the process at CAYSH. And what we want this call to do is to give all of you that are listening, whether you're aspiring, existing, or people who are thinking about appointing young trustees, a realistic overview of what it's like joining a board. And that induction does follow some formal processes and some informal processes, as you remember from some of the previous webinars that we've had. So I'm going to kick off with the very first question, which is to ask the chair, as a new trustee of CAYSH, if I was joining the board, what is the first thing you offer me?
So yeah, the first thing to say is that's not the first time I've met you, and it's important to recruit well. So we have a process at CAYSH whereby I begin with an informal meeting and conversation, no obligation meeting with the individual, tell them exactly what's expected of them, talk about the charity in general, then move through a process of then meeting the chief executive and formally then applying, and then through a panel. So by the time we're at that first sort of stage, if you like, I'm hopeful that we've recruited well and they know what they're letting themselves in for. What I would offer to a young trustee, and I would hope CAYSH has been a leader in this. We have, I think, 5 or 6 people on the board who are below the age of sort of 35. Is opportunity to contribute to a charity that itself has a focus on young people, opportunity to develop. And my experience of having young trustees on the board is that pretty much the only thing they lack is experience, and that's not their fault. So I can hopefully give them that, and they learn pretty quick. And so opportunity, a sense of purpose and belonging, and a sense to learn how to operate at a board level, which is a particular skill and a particular, it's a good grounding, I think, for a life involved in decision making and reaching that kind of consensus view whilst being able to constructively challenge and so on and so forth. So in a single word, opportunity, but you've heard my longer answer. So.
Rachelle, you said earlier that you were chair of one of the subcommittees. What is the sort of induction process you have for subcommittees? Because sometimes, and we've covered this in previous webinars, but the subcommittee is the really good chance for people to A, show off their skills, or B, learn about a subject area they know a little bit about, but sort of want to learn more, and C, deep dive into detail that might not be done at the actual boardroom. What was an induction for a new committee member look like, especially as you're the chair?
Yeah. That's a really good question, Leon. And on reflection, we don't actually have a process for inducting new members to the subcommittee at the moment. The way by which we identify what subcommittee might be useful is through those initial conversations with trustees when they join, getting an understanding of what it is that their skills are, their experience in, and what are they hoping to gain. So someone might join with a background in finance but really want to expand their horizon and understand the other side of the picture, so they might go to the People and Services Committee, for example, or as you mentioned, someone might want to kind of show off their skills and really apply it, and so they'll join the finance subcommittee. What I try to do is kind of have a conversation with them at the beginning, but unlike when we've had trustees join the kind of full board, we haven't formalised that process, and is something that I'm hoping to do more of.
And that was going to be my next question, actually, but you already answered it, which is, you know, as a chair and as a learning organisation, as a learning trustee and chair, kind of what would you add to enhance the offer? But you've sort of already gone there. But I want to talk to you a little bit more, Rachelle, about your skills in particular, because one thing that has come up in all of these webinars in the past is the lack of finance skills amongst young trustees. But actually, I think it's a lack of finance skills amongst trustees generally. But actually, because younger people tend to be pretty open and honest about what they're bad at, as opposed to older experienced trustees who've got 40 years under their belt. But is there anything that you think you needed to know when you first joined the board that either didn't appear to be true and you've managed to go through it without that knowledge, or stuff that you thought, actually, this is a pretty good thing to understand before I join a board?
From the finance side in particular, I guess one thing that would have been good to know is, I guess, how kind of budgets are managed between different programs and how kind of budgets are allocated to kind of central team pots and kind of overheads. I think to your point around whether young people don't have finance skills, I completely agree with you that they do come with a lot of experience. And we've been quite fortunate that we've got young people with finance skills who might be working in audit, accounting, other kind of financial investment services. And so they have exactly the right level of skill to be bringing to the organisation and the committee. And I think separate to that, other things that would be useful to know as kind of joining as a young trustee, I'd kind of want to get a better understanding of how the kind of broader staff within the organisation view the group of trustees, and what are they expecting to get out of their kind of the people that kind of lead the organisation and kind of sign off on the strategy and set the strategy, which is kind of very different to finance.
And before we shift on to a sort of step-by-step guide of how to do an induction properly, Mick, you've been on the board for 8 years. Reflecting on those 8 years, is there anything you wish you had known in sort of year 1 to 3 that would have made you a better trustee or a more competent trustee for those 8 years of CAYSH? And having reflected on being a chair for just over a year now, is there anything you wish you had known going into the chair role that you might have thought you would known as having been a trustee already for 6 and a bit years?
Yeah, let me take the first, trustee. What I think in my very first meeting as a trustee in our then old Croydon offices, and we're in our 3rd set of offices since I joined now, I asked a question of the finance director at the time when we had one, and I wasn't hugely satisfied with the answer. But I thought I was being quite bold in my first meeting, asking a question. Wasn't hugely satisfied with the answer, but allowed it to go. And then spoke to a couple of members of the committee of the board, and they said, "Good question, good question." And it's been needing to be asked for a while. And at the next meeting, there wasn't a satisfactory answer. And I thought, oh, there's something quite wrong here. And it took me 3 or 4 meetings to return to it. And the truth is, my instincts, as it turned out, were right. And what I discovered is that bad news doesn't get better by waiting. And the chances are a good question, a question that needs asking in your first meeting probably needs asking. And so I would be a little bolder as a trustee to begin with. And it's something I've taken into, I hope, and Rachelle, I hope, backs me on this, but I often say to new trustees, your first meeting is, don't be a grey trustee for 2 or 3 meetings to get into your stride. Whilst you might not know very much yet, I really care about what you think. And your absence of knowledge and your absence of experience are that we can address those. But what I really need you to do is engage. And your view is as important on your first meeting as it is on your last meeting. So as a trustee, I'd have been bolder and a little more insistent on getting to the bottom of things, which is strange, actually, because it's something I think happens on charity boards. People are often recruited to charity boards because of what they do in their professional life. And then they seem to check some of that at the door and act differently. If something needs addressing, it needs addressing. In terms of chair, I think what I would do, oddly, is be bolder still. And as I was just saying to Rachelle and to Meg, actually, before the meeting kicked off, I'm probably going to be chair for about 3 years, at the end of which I'll have been on the board 10, and that's long enough for anybody. We have 4 main board meetings a year, and they last 2.5 to 3 hours. So I've got about between 30 and 36 hours board time in 3 years with them. Now, there's a multitude of other meetings that go on. Actually, I'm a year in. I've already had 4, nearly 5 of those meetings. 5th one's coming up. We've had COVID, of course. So quite quickly, I'm getting into 35% of my time as chair. And I've changed a few things. And one of them is to rapidly upscale the numbers of people on the board, but also to bring in a lot of new trustees, younger trustees. So be bolder earlier, and recognize that in terms of governance, that there are pinpoints in the year where you can have that effect. And if you don't take that opportunity, it can be 3 months before you can do so again. I hope that's helpful. Bit rambling, I think, but.
It's a really good point, and one we have touched on, that actually sometimes your life cycle as a trustee is really short, especially of a well-established charity where you tend to meet 4, maybe 6 times a year. For those of you watching who are interested in smaller charities, I was talking to a charity today that turns over about £80,000, and they meet 12 times a year. So they meet once every month. I don't know what they talk about in those 12 meetings, but there's something there around when you're applying for a role, and we've mentioned this before, about being upfront and honest about your commitment and asking them about the commitment they expect from you. Now, I want us to move into, because people are here to learn how to do an induction properly, so I want to move into the bulk of it, which is really going to help provide a sort of step-by-step guide for people. And Rachelle, I'm going to come to you first on this. So you're getting a 10-second head start before I ask the question, which is, as a new trustee, what do you think is the essential you need to know in an induction, and what is it okay to learn as you go along? So what are the key sort of 3 or 4 things you should know going into a boardroom?
You need to have a really good understanding of the services that the organisation offers. So what does it do? What is, I guess, the bread and butter of the organisation. I think a really good understanding of the size, the people, the kind of staff makeup, and so who's contributing to what services. That's 2 things. And I think, you go into the meeting with kind of armed with those 2 pieces of information. I think you'll be on a really good footing. I think you'll need to have a good understanding of the current financial position of the organisation, and how the organisation gets its income and its key expenditure items, which relate to the people and the services, but probably a little bit more detail of the ins and outs of those. Those are the things I'd say.
Thank you. And Mick, anything you would add as a chair, talking to potential trustees about the sort of back reading they should do before they come into the room?
Yeah. First of all, I'd echo something that Rachelle said there about the services. It can be quite, I imagine, I came to trusteeship later in my life, but I can imagine as a young trustee stepping into a boardroom, it can be quite a daunting thing. It's important to realise that the governance needs to be set in the context of what the charity does. It's there to enable the charity. The charity is not there to enable the board. And so you're there to make the charity work better and to hold people account to do that. And so spend time learning what the charity does, learn where it spends and how it spends its money, who spends it, how is it getting value, how is it measuring the value that it adds to the service users, to its beneficiaries. That's really important. I'd say too, grow an awareness and a curiosity, the sort of professional curiosity that you might bring to your jobs. If you work in IT, I imagine that you read a little about what is going on in IT generally. You don't want to be caught out by things. You've got an interest in it. I'm not one of these people that believes you have to be absolutely passionate about the cause of your charity to be an effective trustee. I think people can add great value without necessarily having that passion. I think it's very difficult to add value though if you don't have a curiosity about the sector. And so I follow some streams about youth homelessness. I follow people on Twitter. If people like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others produce a report, I'll do my best to at least read the executive summary and find out what's going on. Take an interest in the borough, for example. I don't live in Croydon, I live in Sutton in the next door borough, but I follow a couple of sites on Croydon. Just to get that kind of professional curiosity about what it is, because then you can start putting some of the things into context. And in youth homelessness, it's a politically active area of interest. Post-COVID, it's going to change, explode, be challenging, all of those things. And the chief executive and the senior leadership team, they're immersed in this every day. I think they have a right to expect the trustees to know a little bit about the sector they're operating in. So I'd say be professionally curious as you would be at work, and be aware and recognise that the governance is in the context of what the charity does.
Great. I think for those of you that are watching this who are new to the charity sector, I've just posted something in there to help with your professional curiosity about the sector at large, because that Civil Society is a free news agency that focus purely on the charity sector. You might have heard of Third Sector. They put a lot of their stuff behind a paywall. This is free, so it's worth having a look at that. Now, I haven't told Mick and Rachelle that I'm going to do this, but Karen and I have been chatting away in the private chat, so I'm going to bring Karen Lam, who not only works at the Social Change Agency, which looks after the Young Trustees movement, but also is a fairly new trustee at CAYSH, and Karen is going to share with us her experience of her induction. Now, as I say, this is cheeky, but this is the power of being the host. So, Karen, you're now unmuted. I'm going to ask you to start your video. Just give us a quick flavour of what it was like.
Hi, everyone. I also was not very prepared, so apologies if I'm rambling. But just reflecting on my onboarding process at CAYSH, I think that being part of the original social change agency team scoping the Young Trustees movement, and what that entailed was talking to a lot of different CEOs, young trustees and board members about kind of the challenges that young person might face. And things that came up, as I'm sure you might know, is around onboarding and kind of that training process about how, there's a lack of training usually, and there's a lack of that kind of formalized process to really induct all trustees, but especially younger trustees, so that they're aware of what's happening. They get to know the organization a bit more. So when I started my induction process with CAYSH, I was very incredibly pleasantly surprised that I got to meet our CEO informally a couple of times, along with other new trustees that were joining. We got to ask her questions around what she required from trustees, some of the challenges that the charity is facing, as well as opportunities. really to get to know the charity a bit more, as well as, you know, the services that they offer. We were also offered to, when we were inducted, we were offered to kind of visit different properties just to meet with the staff, CAYSH staff, as well as some of the young people that we support, and we had a chance to kind of meet and talk to them as well. Again, asking them questions of, you know, what do they need from trustees, what are some of the challenges as well as opportunities. And I guess my last point is around the training. So we were offered to go on training. I think I did mine at NCVO, but my colleagues, they did it, I don't remember where they did it. I think it was Civil Society Futures. But that was very, very valuable for me, you know, just to get the basics of trusteeship, what your roles and responsibilities are, because I think a lot of new trustees, not just young trustees, but, you know, new trustees in general, don't understand fully to the full extent what their legal responsibilities are. And so the training was very, very valuable in terms of clearing that up and kind of building my confidence to know what my role is. And yeah, I think the training was very, very valuable for me upon reflection. And that was my experience at CAYSH.
Great.
So thanks for letting me share that, Leon. I will go back on mute.
Thanks, Karen. Some gold stars there for the CAYSH induction process, which is great. Now, I want to ask a question which, for those who, we have some, there's one person on here for sure who was chair of a small charity, and that's Anthony Wheeler. And I want to ask a question here about the cost of induction. Does induction have to cost pounds and pence? What if you're an organisation that has no money for induction? How do you go about getting your trustees off to a flying start without spending any money?
Is that okay? Sure, to Anthony.
Yeah, it's for both of you, and I should have said that. But Mick, you go first.
So there is a cost. So first of all, there's the training. There's the cost of training that Karen talked about, which and CAYSH, by the way, has a revenue of about 4.2 million, which sounds a great deal of money. But we have staff to deliver services, and they also cost a great deal of money. It's difficult balancing the books. Fortunately, Rachelle is Chair of Finance and Development and is all across that. But the challenges are still there. The training we invest in, and we send people on NCVO and other courses to meet them. There's also a cost in terms of just the time of meeting people at the beginning. And I know I'm slightly repeating myself, but it is quite important, I think, that new trustees understand the level of commitment early on. And if I'm honest, probably a little bit of a trade secret, but I make it a little worse than it actually is, so they kind of, know what they're getting into. Because going the opposite way and saying this is a very low level of commitment and it's 20 minutes reading a month and then it's that doesn't help, because people later on realize they've been hoodwinked. But that cost is cheaper, I would argue, than having no induction, poorly prepared trustees, and then poor decisions or wasted meetings or inefficiency down the line. So yes, there's a cost, but there's also a value of doing it, and I think the value outweighs the cost. One thing I haven't said yet, but I should, just for the record, we do have a trustee handbook which covers a great deal of this stuff, which sets out the expectations of the charity, the sort of tempo of business. We just refreshed it. It's as up to date as we can make it. I'm hoping we'll get the whole thing online at one of these days, and therefore we won't have to keep reissuing it, but one thing at a time. But there is a handbook, and opportunity for training, opportunity to meet the CEO, opportunity to visit some of our projects. And yes, there's a cost to all those things, but if we didn't do them, I think that would show later in the quality of the governance that we experience. And you live with poor governance for a much longer time than you live with the cost of training a trustee.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that, actually. I think all of those kind of different elements are really valuable, and you have the external training that other organisations might run, and then the internal stuff. And I think if there was an organisation kind of looking to see how they might be able to cut the cost. I think it's potentially on the internal staff, and that's not by not doing it, it's just by building it into whatever else might be going on in the organisation already. So, for example, the kind of trips to visit properties that Karen mentioned, there are already staff who would be going out to visit the properties, to visit the young people anyway. So if you could get your trustees to go along on those visits, it means that they're not having to take additional time to do those trips. And similarly, inviting trustees to kind of coffee mornings, to staff meetings, to away days. Those are things that, again, are already happening, and so allow you to kind of feed in meeting the trustees into the staff's kind of existing environment and to the environments young people are already used to. So they get to actually see the organisation deliver and in practice, as well as kind of, throughout the trustee process.
I think that's a really good tip for anyone who is on a board, joining a board and becoming a trustee, because sometimes trustees expect to be shepherded around by the chief executive all of the time. And the problem with that is that every hour the chief exec's spending with you is an hour they're not spending running the organisation. And if your chief exec is on a decent salary because of the size of the organisation you're on, there is a pounds and pence cost to that. So using existing structures that are already there for trustees to see the work, to meet the staff, to could even informally meet, like you say, over coffee mornings, etc., is a really good tool to give prospective trustees so they don't become a burden on the executive. And there was something that you mentioned earlier, Mick, which was about sometimes a good recruitment process can cut the need or create shortcuts for the induction process. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm a great fan of the informal conversations prior to application. I've probably held, I don't know, maybe 24 of those over my time, not just as chair, but prior to that. And I'd say on maybe 5 or 6 occasions, people didn't go through with a formal application. And that's time well spent, because if it's not right for an individual and they know at that stage, then let's all part as friends and not try and force a square peg into a round hole. I've lost the thread of your question, Leon. I started to go down the line. Bring me back, please.
It was when a good recruitment process can sort of do some of that induction for you.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do, for example, is we standardise the questions that we ask at the recruitment interview. So when somebody finally applies, we do insist on having a process because A, it's good practice. B, the vast majority of our money comes from the public sector. It comes from commissioners who buy us, and they, I think, want to know that we have processes in place to appoint trustees that are sound. But actually, until probably, frankly, it was one of the things I wanted to do. We have the same set of questions, which allows us to really explore exactly the motivations and the commitments and the understanding of the individual that's applying. Now, it sounds a very simple thing, but it's remarkable the different range of answers you get from the same question from different people. And you begin to form a view of whether somebody has really got an understanding of the organisation. An example, she's not on the call, but one of our, I'll embarrass her in her absence, Jerusha Kamani, who joined us recently last year. When I asked her to explain what CAYSH did, she gave a textbook answer that I, frankly, couldn't have done. She'd absolutely got under the skin of the organisation. She'd listened to everything. You sit in the room and you listen to that and you think, yeah, you get it. And if you've given her down to get to that stage, I kind of think you're going to continue to be professionally curious enough to get yourself involved in making it happen. So what I mean by that is if somebody sails the recruitment, if they show the professional curiosity, if they clearly have thought about the challenges and the dynamics in the room, if they recognize that challenging colleagues, especially on the first meeting, it's an interesting dynamic, challenging people you've never met before. It really is. We don't do it in most of our lives. Actually, we give everybody space to grow, don't we? If they work that out, the chances are they're almost self-inducting because they're finding out the stuff they need to know. So that's why I think a recruitment process can aid an induction, because a good hire, to use a commercial parlance, it settles more easily. The other thing that we do in Incura is to give them opportunities to ask questions, and the quality of the questions coming back often is a really good indicator of whether somebody is going to, go the extra mile to find out, to land themselves in the organisation. So it's tempting to think induction begins on appointment. I think in some ways it begins almost at the point where they formally submit an application to join the organisation. That's a bit sweeping, but it's kind of where my head is, I think.
That's good. And you mentioned the word dynamic there, which I want to bring in. And Rachelle, get ready to unmute, because the question is about something you can't learn in an induction process is the dynamic between being a subcommittee chair, reporting to a chair sort of, and then slipping back into the boardroom as an ordinary trustee who is only the chair of the committee when the committee report comes to the board or whatever. So talk to us a bit about the dynamic between you and Mick as a subcommittee chair and as the chair of the board. How does it work?
So I guess, and that's specifically a dynamic between the two chairs, the committees.
Yeah.
So I guess the way that we have it at the moment, and it hasn't always been the case, is that Mick, as chair of trustees, doesn't actually attend any of the subcommittees, and that's so that he can kind of attend the kind of full trustee meetings, have a very kind of impartial view of any discussions that have been had, and particularly in kind of cases where the two subcommittees, the other one being people and services, comes to a different conclusion to that of the finance and development subcommittee. So I guess in that sense, then the kind of chairs have kind of free rein to kind of lead the meeting, be able to kind of facilitate that discussion within the meeting itself. In terms of how we feed back to kind of Mick, kind of what's happened, I guess unless there's anything that's particularly kind of troubling that we're struggling with, or that we feel like needs to be shared in advance, any kind of sharing would happen within the trustee meeting itself. And so the process we have is that prior to the kind of new papers being read out and presented by the chief exec and chief operating officer, we have a brief kind of 10 minutes on each of the subcommittees to feedback the key conclusions and the key points of discussion within the subcommittee itself. So outside of that, I think, Mick, I'll only kind of mention something to you if I feel like it's kind of worth mentioning and that you need to have a bit of a heads up in advance. But yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's fine. There was a practical reason. So my predecessor was the living legend that is Bob Cook, who served CAYSH brilliantly. Bob's background was very different to mine. He'd worked in children's services, Barnardos and such like for many years. He was a retired man, and his personal style was to get under every single issue. That's not my style. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. That's not my style. But he certainly had the time to prepare for these meetings. I, on the other hand, I'm still in full-time employment, and I just came to the view. So what was actually happening is that Bob's style was to attend both of the committee meetings, and that the minutes of those meetings would be presented to main board. That two things were obvious to me. One is that gave the executive team a huge staffing challenge, because there were often changes to an issue in between a subcommittee dealing with it and the main board that they had to rebrief. So the briefings became very complicated. I know it says that on page 22, but actually since then this has happened, and so the briefing says this. And the main board sometimes got itself wrapped around unpicking the facts as opposed to dealing with the issues. And the second reason that I didn't like, I didn't want to attend myself is the arbitration point that Rachelle made so well, which is sometimes there can be an issue between people and services, not an outright argument, but I envisaged attending people and services and agreeing with something, and attending finance and development and agreeing with something, and suddenly realised I was agreeing with something that was in conflict. And if it came to me for arbitration and I'd been part of the decision-making process just by being in the room, then that potentially made my governance job all the harder. So it was a deliberate step to step back and to ask the chairs of the two committees to present a 15-minute summary of where they were. We also concertinaed the meetings and brought them closer together. So the theory is that the executive team have 4 quite condensed periods of briefing prep. It goes sort of PSC, FDC, main board. FDC, I think, was last week. We've got main board coming up next. We had PSC 2-3 weeks ago. In theory, those papers shouldn't change a huge amount in between. The dynamic, though, is that I cede to the chairs the fact that it's their committee, and it's not mine to run, nor is it mine to run by extension. So I hope Rachelle agrees. I've given her full range to run the thing as she wants to. It was really difficult for her because she succeeded me as chair of finance, and she'd been a member of the finance committee and watched me do it. And I decided to attend one, hand over, and get out of Dodge. And she has been and is brilliant. Now, for all I know, she's a terrible chair in there, and I wouldn't know, but I would expect trustees to come to me and say so. So I think the dynamic is based on trust and openness, and I hope Rachelle knows, and I know she has done, called on me out of committee and at different times just to raise something, and she knows that I'll do the same. So that's the dynamic as I see it, and it works exactly the same in people and services.
Thanks. And Philippa sent me a comment privately on the chat, and I'm going to read it out because there isn't a question in there, but I'm going to create a question on the back of it. Philippa said, I struggle to get existing trustees to attend training, whereas new and younger trustees are used to a culture of continuing education and expect to attend training. I then end up with an imbalance on the board where long-serving trustees say they have never had an induction or training and don't see the need for it. That's where the comment ends. So the question is, as two chairs, how do you encourage long-serving trustees to attend training when they think they know it all? Let's start with Rachelle.
I guess speaking from the point of the subcommittee, I've not yet had to go through this as the committee is currently made up of all kind of new members. And I am the longest serving, having been there 3 years. So I'd like to defer to Mick to reflect on this.
Great.
Okay, by the way, put that into context. When I became chair, there were only 7 trustees, and we'd had a number of completely non-sinister resignations from the board. Somebody with a family, a new baby came along, somebody's job relocated, somebody became chair of Citizens Advice Bureau, and due to an occurrence, and suddenly we were down. And I wanted to go out and recruit, and I particularly wanted to recruit younger people to a charity that has a very young focus. That's sort of, and I would echo the point that I know that there are charity boards where trustees have been for a very long time and don't feel they've got anything to learn. What would I say to that? First of all, I think it's in our trustee handbook that we expect people to attend training regularly. Sometimes it can be hard to keep on top of that. I personally have attended training in the last 2 years. In fact, my very first day as chair was on the 1st of April last year, and I went to the NCVO conference and sort of absorbed myself in stuff, and I intend to book on a piece of training this year. If there are trustees on a board that believe they know everything, then they're wrong, and they can't. And I would have worry about self-awareness. I would actually raise it potentially at a board issue if you're not looking for advice. But if I thought it was an issue at CAYSH, I think what I would do is table an agenda item perhaps for trustees only and a trustees only group without the executive team there to talk about board development and expectations and training, and agree a principle that, you know, in any 2-year period, somebody should do a piece of training. Now that can be very difficult with a volunteer board. A lot of the training takes place during the day. Some people work, and so on and so forth. And it is one of the factors with a young board, actually, that far more of us work than did when I joined the board. And so we've moved our meeting nights from Thursday night, which is often, if you're in a professional environment where people go out for farewell drinks, to Tuesday nights, because actually people were saying, I can't come, or it was so-and-so's farewell, or whatever, I'm missing it. So I would, going back to my earlier comment, bad news doesn't get better with age. I'd face it head on and perhaps table a broad discussion at board about board development, and see if we can get agreement around the table that people should attend training. And if they feel they shouldn't, okay, if that's maybe it, but it's good practice. It's good practice.
I think there's something, a topic that we haven't covered that is definitely one for a future one, is how to get rid of crap trustees. Not saying that the trustees are crap necessarily, but actually what are the powers that a chair can use or a board can use to move people off of a board? Because you do hear quite often of chairs that are stuck with trustees that have been there forever and can't seem to get rid of them. So we'll pause that for a future conversation. I just want to ask anybody if they have any final questions. I've seen that Meg has tweeted that too. Whilst those questions come in, is there anything that either of you would like to say that the questions so far haven't given you a chance to say about induction and training?
I guess for me, I'd say kind of, we've spoken about induction in terms of when you first join, but to the point that Mick just made, that induction process, I guess it does link into ongoing training and ongoing understanding of the organisation. And so kind of think about implementing those kind of practices and activities into a kind of recurring cycle. So just because someone might have met the staff in week 1 when they first joined, doesn't mean they shouldn't be meeting them kind of more regularly, such as 2 years later, three years later, and so on. The dynamics of the organisation and the services that are being delivered change quite a lot in that time, and so it's good to kind of refresh your understanding of what's happening. So I guess
my comment, Leon, of stuff that hasn't been raised yet is I think the pandemic is going to fundamentally change and offer opportunities for governing in a slightly different way. So an example would be attendance at our board and committee meetings has gone up in the pandemic because people don't have to travel. One of the decisions I took with the chief executive is to separate from the normal governance tempo any COVID updates. So we built in a weekly non-mandatory attendance briefing from the chief executive on what we were doing around COVID, because I didn't want the main board and the committees to become to keep their eye off the ball, lose their eye off the ball. Actually, convening a board now is hugely easier than it was, and so I think what we might find, certainly I can't. One of my trustees, Rachelle, lives in Luton. She attends board meetings in Croydon and then catches a train back, and she hasn't missed a meeting, by the way. She'll be able to give more of her time to governance, I think, as a result of everybody being more comfortable operating like this. And I can see a hybrid governance model where we meet maybe twice a year, but actually for a more social, informal interaction, and we perhaps govern through this. So I do think there's an opportunity coming out of COVID to govern in a slightly different way. I'm also a governor of a university, and we've convened a couple of meetings and suddenly found 15 people available tomorrow, because I've only got to find an hour for the meeting. I haven't got to clear my diary, get over to Kingston, It's not half a day anymore. It is just an hour. And so there are opportunities, I think, to make governance a little more focused, and rather than having 4 set piece boards a year, maybe we'll be able to be a little more focused and offer a different kind of support and challenge to the chief exec.
Great, and that's bang on to 7:15, which is great because we like to run a tight ship. So I would like to say a very big thank you to both Mick and Rachelle for joining us this evening. I hope you found that very useful. And the pitch for next week is that we have our final Q&A before a break. It's on online trustee recruitment, and we have Janet Thorne, the Chief Exec of Reach Volunteering. For those of you that have been on the calls before, that is the go-to trustee recruitment platform, really. Simon Elliott, Chair of Northern Stage, and Karis Thomas, who's the ambassador for the Young Trustees movement in the Northeast and a trustee for Northern Stage 2. So we're going to be talking about online recruitment during that. And in another future topic, I just want to add to this recording that Mick brought up is how the sort of opportunities and pitfalls that coronavirus has caused for boards. And I think there's something in there that you said around, you know, adapting and innovating, doing things differently. But there will be some risks. So let us pause there, but think about that for the future. And once again, a very big thank you to both of you for coming and for everybody else that participated. We will upload a recording of this tomorrow, along with some research on the Young Trustees Hub, which will include some links where you can find more information, some free training and other bits to sort of top up your knowledge. So thank you both of you and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Good luck. Thank you.